The Marcian by Stephen Sinclair. 1. Let me see if I can remember the exact words from Dr. Baker's article in that prestigious academic review. Professor Henshaw's theory is on a par with such ridiculous and long-ago exploded ideas as Murray's witch cult theory, or the notion that the fairies of Western folklore have their origin in the survival of pre-Iron Age people into early modern times, one which I believe is still popular with some school children when they stumble on it for the first time in a book of unknown mysteries. The so-called evidence he presents is even more unsound than the sad, hackneyed lore trotted out in support of these and others of similar ilk. They rest on such vague and contradictory fragments that they move so quickly and with painful obviousness beyond merely the fragmentary, or to be kind, might diffuse that we are. And I must say, given the quality of his past work almost tragically, into what is essentially the made-up. His theory is literally just bad fiction. Caputo fell silent. He regarded Professor Henshaw with his narrow, intense eyes, his short, fat fingers linked over his shirt front. Henshaw said nothing. He just dabbed at the bloody wound on his forehead with the handkerchief Caputo had given him. Caputo resumed. As for Muller at Yale, he says my old teacher's theory that there were... Please, Henshaw held up a hand suddenly, interrupting him. Please spare me, Muller. Marking Muller's work when he was an undergrad was bad enough, like being forced to eat my dinner in the same room as a 3-week-old dead syphilitic poodle. But he had the grace to have some generosity of spirit and open-mindedness, although they were his only virtues, unlike now. As for Jane Baker, although she never possessed those qualities, she had some talent at least, although the size of her arse long since surpassed it. Caputo laughed. He was surprised by Henshaw, pleasantly and gratifyingly surprised, and impressed. Many younger, stronger, and presumably more inherently physically vital men than Henshaw would now be quivering wrecks. But the old limey was keeping it together. Mr. Caputo had the experience to know this was remarkable. Lots of experience. The professor was now surprisingly calm. His initial, unsurprising panic when he, Caputo, and the large men he called his associates had woken him in the middle of the night in his own room had not lasted long. In the first moments he had struggled, and one of the large young men had struck him. This had been heavy-handed and unnecessary. Besides, he needed the man Henshaw alive. He had sent the man away into another room and apologized to the professor. They were now sat in the said professor's study. Said study was satisfactorily overflowing with books, as Caputo he had always imagined it would be. He sat on one side of a very large, very untidy old desk. Two of his associates, who were of course made men, standing on either side of him. Henshaw sat opposite, with another two of the soldiers standing, or rather looming over him. There were 3 more in the next room. Henshaw simply stared at him with gray, unreadable eyes. His long-bearded English face was a mask. Unperturbed, Caputo continued. Very well, we'll leave Professor Muller. Anyway, it's not your interesting theory about all these supposed unknown languages and even written scripts all up and down the European Atlantic seaboard's littoral area, controversial as it is, that got you in trouble, made your star fall so far. It was that little stunt you pulled at your last teaching post in Oxford. He fell silent. Knowing when to shut up was an integral part of this kind of situation, at least if you wanted to get anywhere. Henshaw's expression didn't change, but somehow Caputo knew he had the man's attention, his full attention. Even under circumstances like these, it was difficult to get a guy's full attention. Now he had it. That was good. Slowly, Professor Henshaw said, "And what was that, Mr. Caputo?" Caputo didn't bother to ask Henshaw how he knew who he and his associates were. He would have been disappointed if the man hadn't known. Instead, he just answered the question, concentrating on getting the quotation correct. An undergraduate asked you to give an example of a Socratic question. So you wrote out in ancient Greek, "It is of course absurd, irrational, and prejudiced to suppose that people who believe it is necessary, for the sake of both decency and morality, that women should only go about in public heavily veiled, with only their eyes visible, would regard women who do not do this as anything other than decent and moral. Surely we can all agree about this under all circumstances." Professor Henshaw gave him a slow hand clap and said, "Bravo, Mr. Caputo. The authorities at the university were even more keen to bury the exact details than they were to bury my career. I'm impressed. In any case, I was long past retiral age. Besides, it was a stupid thing to do. Confusion of thinking is not just a symptom of the modern world. It's a necessary component. I at least was not offered hemlock." Caputo chuckled. "But your theory on all those unknown languages and written scripts—" Again, Henshaw held up a hand and interrupted him. Men had been killed for less. In this case, he found himself amused. "I didn't ever say languages," said Henshaw. "I said dialects, so diverse. They were essentially languages. As for the written scripts, the people who lived in those areas were all traders. It was only natural that they would write things down, for what we would call business reasons, if nothing else. And we underestimate people in the distant past at our peril. At the core of my theory is the power of the human imagination. Some of the dialects were based on how people in those areas believed even more ancient people to have spoken." They both regarded each other in silence. The professor's wound, made with a gun butt, had stopped bleeding. The old man had not whined, nor had he asked the obvious questions, had not pleaded. Caputo said, "Your translation of Lucretius is still considered the standard text, so I don't have to ask you who Poggiobracciolin was, and you're one of the few men I don't have to explain the legend of what else he's supposed to have found when he rediscovered the last copy of Lucretius in that monastery in Germany in 1417. The legend is that he also found the complete book of Marcian, the 3rd century BCE Roman soothsayer," said the professor. Caputo spoke. "He did find it, and now I have it. You, Mr. Caputo, have been the head of the biggest organized crime family on the East Coast of the United States for the last 30 years, so I'm not going to ask you stupid questions. You wouldn't have come all this way if you weren't serious." Caputo was very, very impressed by this. He made a mental note that the associate who had struck the professor was going to be punished in a very severe, very final way. He resolved that they would go old-school Sicilian on the man, and then put him under a place where ducks or chickens could take a dump on him. He began to explain why he had come. 2. When Caputo was 14, he had broken both his legs very badly, had been laid up for a long time. It always annoyed him that everyone immediately assumed that it had been anything other than the simple accident it in fact had been. Normal accidents happened to him regardless of who his father was. If he had been a bit younger, or if it had been a few years later, what happened then wouldn't have happened. A few years later, he would just have wasted his time on the internet, like kids did these days. One of his uncles had given him a box full of old paperbacks and saying, "Learn to appreciate this stuff, kid. Learn something." He was stubborn enough to have just thrown them aside, but sullenly, contrarily, he decided to read them. They were mostly old horror stories. He had fallen in love with Lovecraft and Poe. When he read Machen's The White People, he'd been surprised that something that good could exist. But that had not been the moment of true revelation. That had come when he found the translation of Livy's History of Rome. Specifically, the part about the war with Hannibal. The translation and the academic notes were by the man who now sat across the desk from him, and he who the teachers at school, including the nuns, one of whom had once told the class that Jesus doesn't love left-handed children whilst not daring to look at him, despised and only tolerated because they feared his father, had found he not only understood it, but loved it. In his world, respect was more important than money, and the book told him clearly that his own people's ancestors were where respect came from. The story of that war was the wellspring of all else. He had never changed his opinion. When he was up and about again, his father and uncles noticed a difference in him. They noticed the signs that he was striving to be a stand-up guy. They had thought he was a bit of a punk before, but there was something more. It had been almost a footnote within Livy's book, supported by another footnote by the man opposite him now, a name and a short quotation of prophecy, and somehow it not only stayed with him, but it also became integral to who he was, and although it of course had nothing to do with him directly, was about the Battle of Caen, it represented a voice that spoke to him, was for him, he was sure. Part of what made him so formidable was that he never questioned his gut. His passion for books had lasted all his life. He now had one of the finest private libraries in New York, and he had not long after becoming head of the family sent a discreet search for one book particularly in motion. A book that was said not only to no longer exist, but by many, never to have existed. But he had never given up, and last year it had been found. He had the book translated by the best, and then there had come the greatest moment of his life. Also, the moment that might save his life, and the most frustrating. 3. Professor Henshaw asked him, "Is it safe? You obviously don't have the Marcian here, but is it safe?" For the first time there was anxiety in the man's voice. Caputo respected this. The man had not been a disappointment. He made another mental resolution that it would be unnecessary to whack Henshaw after they were done. He assured the man it was very safe, in a completely secure, environment-controlled location. Henshaw had asked him who he'd got to do the translation. How old was the book? To the second question, 8th century. Beautifully illuminated. Probably from one of the big French monasteries. In answer to the first, Lavator from Harvard. Henshaw grunted, a satisfied sound. Well, at least you got the best. It was now Caputo's turn to interrupt. He pointed a finger at the professor's chest. Not quite the best. I wanted you to do it. But no response. None. Finding you at all was difficult. And then a big zero response. You've no family. You don't even own a goddamn dog. So you weren't open to forms of persuasion. I won't be vulgar and describe to a gentleman. Hence the need for this early morning visit. Both men were silent. They regarded each other, both lost in thought. Earlier, Henshaw had really heard one of the unnecessarily large and unnecessarily ugly young men, all of whom no doubt had Italian-sounding names, but who wouldn't know how to speak that language, refer to Caputo under his breath as Don. He had nearly laughed. He had once read a rather brilliant book about these jackals. The man who wrote it was apparently now in hiding. His unforgivable crime had been to point out that these men based themselves more and more on how they were depicted in the movies, rather than the other way round. Henshaw had been interested but not surprised. Long ago he had decided that all stupid people were more comfortable in a world that was in imitation of art. Looking at the young men made him have an image of gorillas in top hats. But not Caputo himself. He didn't think he was stupid, or absurd, or even worse, a cliché. The day before, Caputo had caught a British TV show in his hotel room. It had been all about the buying and selling of antiques. What had fascinated him about it was what already fascinated him about this country. In the audience at the auction room, he had never seen so many wasps in one place. Not even down in the deep South back in the States. Lots of the rednecks there were, after all, Scots-Irish. There in the audience they all sat. Mostly boomers like himself. The pasty, white, wrinkled faces of the people his occasional allies. And now, and more often, his deadly rivals. The Colombians and Mexicans called gringos. Sat there with the heavy-lidded, greedy, complacent eyes of good law-abiding citizens. They were, of course, all fools. Saps, marks, to be exploited by men like him, the protection rackets, the girls, the dope, the gambling, everything. It was all the same, all about getting one over on the wasps. Caputo was an educated man. He knew how things worked, the very formidable nature of the powerful institutions. The wasps had made and were so good at making, and therefore relied on, was what left them wide open. And what had they used those institutions for? Might a person not ask? They had done to the world what our thing had done on an infinitely smaller and infinitely more harmless scale. It was kind of funny. Apparently they worried about immigration in this country, and that was also funny. And you only had to ask the Plains Indians back home or the Australian Aboriginals down under why it was funny. Although they might not laugh, nowadays he himself mostly made his money through legitimate businesses that were sometimes just a bit creative with the accounts they gave the IRS. But how much money had the countrymen of the man who sat opposite him stolen from India? These thoughts ran through his mind in a kind of edited shorthand. But he didn't think Henshaw was a fool. Henshaw had his own thing. It was in the books piled up all around. It was in the eager and hungry way the old man had said, "Is it safe?" 4. What I don't understand, Mr. Caputo, is what you need me for. If Lavator's done the translation, then I assure you it's sound. Why go to all this trouble? Why come yourself? Why not simply send some of these, Henshaw paused, charming fellows? Caputo smiled thinly. He gestured to one of his men, a man so large and hugely ugly that Henshaw was reminded of an animated fridge and an expression from his youth about certain brick houses. "Freddie, bring those papers here, please." Freddie obeyed, handed his boss a A4 manila folder. It was like seeing a gorilla with a lady's handkerchief. Mr. Caputo removed some papers and handed them across the desk to Professor Henshaw. "Before I answer your question, here is a small sample of Professor Lavator's work. The good professor is not able to talk his latest project due to concerns about his family." Henshaw just smiled back at him, took the papers and began to read. Caputo had already ordered his men, apart from Freddie, out the room. 5. And I was made to see that we are surrounded, all our lives surrounded by tiny devils. They are so tiny they are smaller than the smallest grain of sand, smaller than a grain of salt. And they are as numberless as the sands of the great sand sea, numberless as the stars in the sky. They are endless, and it is they who vex us with illness, fevers and agues. It is they who make wounds go bad. They are the ones who vex us with these things. And the little devils are mortal. They can be drowned in strong wine poured into wounds. They can be drowned in vinegar. Terrible is the burden of what I was made to see. This Jupiter showed this to me. And in the north and south of the world, the light of the sun only grazes the world, and the world becomes a great white desert of ice. Northward a frozen sea, southward a frozen land of ice. I was made to feel the cold of cold. This Jupiter showed to me, and there was I showed that there is not one world but many, and many truths, and there are not 4 elements but many. Many. It made my mind burn. These things Jupiter showed me. Henshaw looked up, and something passed between the two men. A moment of shared delight. The Mafia boss saw with interest that although delighted, Henshaw wasn't surprised, and remarked about this fact with more interest. "I think you'll find that most men and women are far less unwilling to accept what might be called the supernatural than most writers, and such would have us believe. I take it from the small sample here that that's the direction the work takes. After all, Marcian wasn't sometimes called doomsayer for nothing. I would also add, Mr. Caputo, that although they would never admit such a thing, my former colleagues in Oxford, particularly in the physics department, have revealed and are revealing a world in which it would probably make more sense to talk about the habits of nature rather than her laws." Caputo nodded and laughed quietly. "And that's only a small sample of what's in the Martian. Which brings us to our business," he said. 6. He handed Henshaw another page of the translation, and I saw a time far from my own. I was made to see that I who am a living man was now dust long scattered. Dust on not one wind but 2,300. And I saw a time when men could fly in the air and look in magic mirrors. Everything was numbered. Few were they who were content with their places. And I saw a man who carries the blood of my kind, a man whose name means unwavering and determined, the Filius Malleus, a man of New Iberacum. And I was allowed to call out to this man, "Hear me, if he would be saved, he will be saved. If he would be saved from the cancrum tormenta, he must." Here the legible words ended. They were replaced by a series of nonsense words in which the letters all and H predominated. There were only a few of them. Evidently, this cryptic gibberish was the unintelligible end of Marcian's message. Henshaw looked at Caputo thoughtfully and said, "Of course you know your family names means unwavering or determined in modern Italian, and New Iberacum means, or could mean, New York. And I believe your late father was known amongst his fellows and rivals as the Hammer, Malleus." Caputo was nodding. "I have cancer, Professor Henshaw. Inoperable. It's still early. Thanks to the drugs, I'm not incapacitated yet, and I'm in the middle of a little war with the Colombians, hence the number of associates I have with me. None of my capos, though. I need them all back in the Big Apple. Lavator tried with that. He really did, and I'm not an unreasonable man. I sent him home. I've even had my contacts with the feds feed that damn stuff into a computer that's so sophisticated it's practically AI nothing. No go. I know that message is for me. Know it. I was meant to find that book, and I also know you're the only one who can do it. He fell silent. He knew instinctively it would be a mistake to threaten this man. A kid's mistake he wasn't going to make. After a while, Henshaw said, "It will take me a few days." 7. Over the next 4 days, Professor Henshaw worked steadily. Caputo thought it was impressive to watch, not least because of the way he defied modern convention by insisting he be supplied with vast amounts of single malt whiskey and black coffee, which he greedily consumed with no apparent effects, detrimental or otherwise. Henshaw sat there smoking endless cigarettes with a wet towel tied in a kind of turban on his head, something that the American had only read about in A Tale of Two Cities. The old limey's capacity for work seemed to be huge. He insisted on regular breaks, though, which Caputo thought was only reasonable. During these, he decided to teach Freddie to play chess. The reason for this was inexplicable. Caputo thought it was a bit like watching someone attempt to teach a bull that dancing horses garbage the English were good at in the Olympics. At first, the big man began to pick it up. A natural stooge and cipher for Caputo's will, he listened to Henshaw when Caputo told him to, and then applied the lessons with dogged determination. It was interesting to look at this process. Freddie won a few games. Freddie had turned to him and said, "I wasn't even any good at checkers, boss." He was, however, still a big, stupid, but reliable muscle. The other associates he sent away. There was no immediate danger here in this out-of-the-way place. He remarked to Henshaw that they were only there because his daughter, who was currently in charge of the New York operation, had insisted. Henshaw had shuddered internally at the thought of this Messalina. 8. Evening in the professor's study, they both sat on either side of the desk. Freddie was a hulking presence behind Caputo's right. Henshaw picked up a piece of paper. "Here's your translation. It's a kind of early Scots Gaelic reimagining of Epidem." "What?" interjected Caputo. "They were mentioned in Tacitus, one of those amusingly antique people who make a mockery of the old bon mot that the Scots are only Irish who learn to swim. The words are in a language by an ancient people who are imagining an even more ancient heroic past. I won't bore you, but the script contains root words for the Gaelic words fortree and heart. That was the key. That and jettisoning the idea that any of this makes any sense, in the commonly accepted meaning. I will read you my translation, and then with your permission, I would like to add a few other little points of my own." Mr. Caputo nodded. Henshaw began. "If he would be saved from the cancrum tormenta, he must go with the man who leads him and one strong warrior. He must go into the lands of the people of sacred horses, and go into the middle lands of that country, into the lands that rise in great waves and slope away. He must go into the place where, as in no other, the Lord God Neptune strides about, as if the land was also part of his kingdom. There he must climb the rocky hill of the tree. For in that place the people I will not name. The little rats sent to the king of that land a gift, sent it to him for helping the cursed son of lightning, who I will also never name. The gift was an image of he who waits, dreaming, under the waves until the end of things, when the stars are right." Caputo interrupted him. Until then he had been hanging on every word. Henshaw laughed quietly. "I see you understand the reference. You don't look pleased. I must confess it doesn't reassure me either." He continued to read. "The people of sacred horses sealed the image inside the hill in a mighty place, hidden under a great stone shaped like a heart. There, in that place, he shall be saved. They set a guardian to stand over it." 9. The Epides lands ran north through what's now Kintyre, Knapdale, and into Lorne. Their territory ended just on the north shore of Loch Awe. Knapdale, the land that rises and slopes away, in the middle of that region. Argyle Poseidon strides about. It's rather fjord-like. I used to spend some of my holidays there as a boy. Finally, the rocky hill of the tree, in Gallic Narkrugus Krob. I happen to know where that is. I climbed it as a boy, as a matter of fact. It's on the Ordnance Survey maps. As for the rest of it, well, evidently Marcian was a typical Roman, at least in some ways. The little rats, Carthaginians, and the son of lightning? Of course, that's Hannibal. There was probably always a contingent of Epidi cavalry in his army. They were mercenaries who hired themselves out all over the Mediterranean world. Probably their horses were bred from Arab stallions and hardy little Highland mares. Henshaw fell silent. Mr. Caputo thanked him and congratulated him effusively. He was also, of course, congratulating himself. He had evidently come to the right man. "Now, if you would allow me, I have some things I would like to say," said Professor Henshaw. Caputo nodded. "Firstly, do you know I wrote a book about the Spartans, about 40 years ago?" Caputo told him he not only knew this, but had the book and had read it. Henshaw was pleased. "And in that book I broke the rules my esteemed colleagues live by and addressed the reader directly in the kind conjecture they also disapprove of. What actors call breaking the fourth wall. I was honest and said that, although I could speak ancient Greek and tell them all about the Spartans, I still couldn't envisage what they were like. I couldn't see those people. When I tried, I simply dragged up my own prejudices. I saw a cross between Vikings and Prussians in ridiculous sandals, perhaps with rather a lot of the Nazis thrown in for good measure, all the time knowing it was nonsense. It's the same basic problem in that old chestnut about the Statue of Liberty. If Lady Liberty, which now stands in your home city, was really discovered centuries from now by people who knew nothing of her, as in that entertaining film, would people not interpret her as a sun goddess? Looking at the torch and rays? I think so. We deal with similar things here. We move into dark waters where we can't navigate. What are we dealing with here, Mr. Caputo? I confess, it's not something I can translate. Caputo looked down at the desk and began to drum his fingers on it slowly. This was a very bad sign. Somehow, without moving, Freddie let it be known that he was aware the bosses was angry. Softly, Caputo said, "I hope this isn't where you tell me there's some stuff we aren't supposed to know." Henshaw laughed. "I wouldn't do that. I would say a great deal of wariness is needed. You've obviously read Alhazred." Caputo nodded. "Next," said Henshaw, "let's assume that it's true. What else is also true? I believe that Loch Awe is what's referred to as a hotspot for paranormal activity. Everything from UFOs, ghosts, and wood weirs. I'm being honest with you. I don't like the sound of, they have set a guardian over it. Don't forget, Professor, I'm dying. And if it's all true, then I get cured. Are you nearly done?" "Very nearly. If I was sensible, I would shut up at this point, Caputo. But I'm not sensible. Never have been. My father was a working chap from York. My mother was a big, loud woman who worked in a shop. Part Italian, as a matter of fact. They never thought I was sensible. I was allowed to get away with it because I was sporty as well as bookish. Also, I chased the girls from a young age, so I didn't worry them in that regard. But they knew I wasn't sensible. This is the last thing I have to say. One of my brothers has been dead for over 50 years now. He was a year older than me. While I find I like you, Mr. Caputo, and enjoy your company, I never liked him or respected him, but he was good. In the old atavistic sense of the word, the force that you could feel coming off him is the opposite of the force I feel flowing from you. My colleagues from Oxford wouldn't find this as sensible. I've laughed along with them at the old joke that the problem with mysticism is that it starts with mist and ends in ism. For them, there's only relativism. And for the initiated Einstein, because E equals mc squared, it means there's only room for matter or energy, no space left for the spiritual, anything messy like that. And the world destroyed my brother. There was always something a little under par about him. Whilst most people never care one iota about notions like good and evil, they can understand what hopelessness means in the vernacular sense. And so they destroyed him. And now a man like you, one who represents the other firm, will not only defy the world by storming up that hill and getting a nice miracle. You'll walk away without a scratch. I don't think it's going to work that way. I don't think it ever works that way. I think you're going to encounter something worse than you can imagine. Terrible evil. Terrible danger. A bit of a weak finish on my part. But there you are. Don't do it. I have nothing else to say. Henshaw fell silent. Mr. Caputo decided that the professor would be coming back to New York. He would be making academic notes for the Marcian and writing a novella-sized introduction to the book. Also talking about it with Caputo. He would then be shot painlessly in the back of the head. Quietly, Caputo said, "It's mine." There was no need for him to elaborate. This statement held everything. "Well," said Mr. Caputo, "at least in a country the size of Central Park, the trip won't be difficult. Also, the most dangerous thing in nature here is a badger." Professor Henshaw just smiled. 10. The trip wasn't easy. The flight into Glasgow was fine, but the journey west, 40 or so miles on the map, seemed to Caputo to be more like 1,000. The twisty turn little road where everyone drove on the wrong side was choked full of trucks and kraut and surrender monkey campers. They were diverted onto a single-track road because of landslides. Freddie annoyed him by, on hearing some of the locals talk, asking, "Where in Ireland are we, boss?" The weather was abysmal. And this was June, apparently. Although he did think that the landscape was beautiful, what he could see of it through the driving rain. He had made sure they were well equipped for where they were going, and he also admitted that the hotel that Henshaw insisted they stay, in a place with an unpronounceable name, was okay in a down-market kind of small place way. They took the 4x4 high into the hills on forestry roads. Even with the car's top suspension, the journey was bone-shaking. The last of the roads stopped a good 8 undulating miles from where they were going. The heather-clad ground seemed to want to grab your legs and stop you. It rained constantly. Freddie plodded along tirelessly, despite the fact he carried a large canvas bag that contained crowbars and strong rope, although he fell into what Henshaw called burns twice. The old Lamy was also uncomplaining, and he was far older than the other two. Henshaw had always been a keen hiker. Caputo, on the other hand, soon felt dead, not just dying. It stopped raining and started to get hot. Caputo cursed foully and continually. He had never imagined such a messed up place. Soon they were all being bitten by mosquito like things that were apparently called midges. Finally, they climbed a low ridge and saw their destination. About a mile away across a heather-clad valley that was a broken mass of hillocks and huge stones shrouded in the last of the mist that the sun was burning off, and that created a kind, if green and purple, opaque haze. There it rose, the rocky hill of the tree, said Henshaw, pointing with his stick. They were already 1,000 feet above sea level. The hill rose to 1,500 feet at its highest point. The sky above it was a blue so vivid it almost looked enameled. What had formerly been a series of lines on the map was a huge ridge about a mile long, set in a curving kidney shape. For about half its length, it was irregularly half as tall as its highest point at the western end, giving it a sphinx-like look. Its lower shoulders covered in huge lichen-clad rocks, carved by the caprices of the elements in time into strange shapes that seemed to hold maddening cryptic meaning. Above this in places it looked as if sheer huge masses of rock had been thrown vertically skyward from the earth long ago. It was as if a huge child had been building a castle, got bored, and cast it down. "Jesus," said Freddie. 11. Caputo insisted that they rest. They had something to eat and drink. Henshaw stood gazing at the hill. Interesting place. In many ways, these Marlins are more out the way than the big Monroes, and this entire place is what I'd call ambiguous. It was a kind of frontier zone between Clan Campbell and the MacDonald Confederacy, and the Romans were here on campaign at least. "Why the hill of the tree?" asked Caputo. "When there's no damn trees up there?" Henshaw began to reply, but Caputo had dismissed him. Soon they began the climb. It was, thought Henshaw, more arduous than difficult. Although it was now himself who insisted they rest, his age was finally beginning to tell. Below them to the west, on their right-hand side, was Loch Sween's jagged coastline. The sea loch was a vivid blue. It could almost have been the Med. Tiny yachts moved on the water, but up here they were completely alone. Finally, they were mainly walking along nearly level rocky ground. They were approaching the summit. Despite the bright, recently rain-washed mountain air, it seemed to somehow have a humped, furtive look. It was perhaps that Caputo himself who found the great stone shaped like a heart. In a kind of peaty, sodden hollow just below the summit, dangerously near a sheer cliff of stone that fell away for at least 500 feet. The rock was 6 feet long and 4 feet wide. It was lodged amongst much smaller jagged stones, the whole surrounded by a rich growth of heather and few strange-looking, stunted alpine plants. It wasn't shaped like the modern caricature of a heart. The great stone looked more like the images you found in early modern black-letter illustrated volumes, those of early autopsies, the anatomy lesson. It looked as if it had been there forever. But it hadn't. They first cleared away some of the smaller stones. All 3 men did this eagerly. Something was now in motion that had its own power. They all wanted to see. They then got a rope round one end, and Henshaw and Caputo pulled, whilst Freddie set to work with the crowbar. The stone may have been in place since long before the Jameses had been kings of Scots, but it was rather easy to move. It was large but thin. It didn't even fall spectacularly over the cliff. It thudded forward heavily onto the heather, and the entrance to a tunnel into the hill was revealed. 12. There wasn't a fetid rush of foul air, or gaping darkness, nor was there sickly-looking luminosity. Instead, there was a dim, pearly-looking light that came from below. Shadows, in a breeze that carried a cold, wet mineral scent. Crude steps were carved into the living rock. They descended steeply and curved away to the right. Faintly, they heard running water. "Probably lots of fissures in the cliffs," said the professor. In some indefinable way, the low arched opening just revealed at the bottom stairs, where they turned to the right, managed to suggest that it opened out into a huge space. But when they went down the steps and turned to the right, Caputo still gasped with awe at the huge cavern that was revealed in the hill's heart. And what was there? Henshaw only said, "Well, well," but his voice shook. For the first time, his voice sounded to himself like that of an old man. Freddie just screamed, "Jesus Christ!" Quietly, Henshaw said, "No! Great Cthulhu!" 13. The statue was huge, at least 10 feet high and built in proportion. It was made of solid gold. The figure was gold. The pedestal it squatted evilly on. Gold. The eyes were 2 huge rubies. The bat-like wings were outspread. It was bathed in water that ran in an eternal stream from multiple points on the cavern roof. In them, the tentacles of the great squid head seemed to writhe. Its image was evilly reflected in a shallow pool of water that lay before it. This also seemed to move disturbingly as some of the falling water struck it. As Henshaw looked at it, he was struck that the style and artistry of the thing was almost as disturbing as the terrible subject. The foul thing had all the concentrated, narrow power that you sometimes find in tribal art. But it was unspeakably horrible to find this side by side with the rank decadence and jaded decay of a civilization old when the Acropolis was unbuilt. The work was undoubtedly Phoenician, Carthaginian. He knew it, although the Romans had made sure virtually nothing of them or their works had been left. The Romans had also been here in these hills and waters, the legions and the imperial fleet, many times, although never for long. Had they known this thing was here? Had they tried to find it and destroy it? Yes, he decided. He didn't question how he knew this, just as he didn't question that he knew the Apadi had been destroyed fighting to defend and keep it. Besides him, Caputo quietly said, "I must go and drink from the pool." The man began to walk forward, and that was when the oak tree walked into view. It moved lightly despite its bulk on its roots like some monstrous octopus, emerged with shocking suddenness from centuries-old shadows, scuttled along like a huge devilfish. The green boughs moved with the impossible flexibility of tentacles. Its mighty stem pulsed and moved hideously. The trunk also had an old man's vicious grinning face. The tree roared. and its voice was like all the sound of all the storms and rains that had once lashed through the long-vanished grove in which it had once stood. Freddy was fumbling uselessly for something in his pocket to try and protect the boss when a branch snapped out like a bullwhip and flicked him to his death against the cavern wall. Then the tree snatched up Caputo. The roaring became tinged with pure ecstasy. It ran to the statue of Cthulhu and turned to face Henshaw. Then it spoke to the professor in English. "See, O mortal man, see my boughs finally bear the fruit they have waited ages to bear, the blood and flesh of a Roman king. Ever will I carry him, even until the dreamer wakes. I am the tree of vengeance. Ever the blood of the murdered shall choke him." The oak tree began to tear Mr. Caputo apart. It impaled his severed limbs from its branches. It tore off his head, and he didn't die. He would never die. He began to scream. "Ever I will be a monument to those who had everything stolen from them." The tree was now draped with Caputo's intestines. His liver was stuck on a thin branch. Impossible amounts of blood flowed and covered the tree. Would always flow. The tree turned and began to shake its prize over the statue of Cthulhu. The pool was red with blood. Professor Henshaw collapsed, terrible pain pulsing from his left arm. Also, I am a monument to chaos, against those kings who would wall the world with living walls of order. May the world one day burn with chaos and freedom. So I am heavy with the flesh of the wellspring of those kings. Henshaw was going to die. His last sight would be of Caputo's impossibly screaming, impossibly alive head held out by the tree. I really am a typical intellectual, he thought, confronted by an impossible metaphysical monster. I still notice the ethical contradictions and unsound premises of what it's saying, and I happen to be dying. Internally, he laughed. "Live, O mortal man! Be a witness to my glory!" The tree flicked some of the blood onto his face. The pain in his chest eased. In all the impossible horror, he managed to somehow crawl out. His last view of the tree was of it resealing the cave like some strange hermite crab. It still bore its fruit. It always would.